So have you, or maybe someone you know, had to replace an air conditioning unit recently? If you have, you know exactly what I'm talking about, the absolute jaw-dropping reality of modern HVAC replacement costs. I mean, it used to be a frustrating, sure, but generally manageable home repair. Today, honestly, it feels like you're buying a piece of luxury real estate just to keep your living room cool. Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to take a structured look at the data, the laws, and the economics behind this massive shift and really unravel the mystery of why replacing your AC has suddenly become one of the most wildly expensive things you will ever do to your home.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Look at this real-world estimate from Holt Plumbing and Heating. This is drawn straight from our source documents. Just look at the bottom line for this 2-ton premium heat pump system package. We are talking about $20,370.40. Now, for almost any homeowner, getting a quote like this, it literally induces immediate panic. You look at that metal box sitting outside your house and you just think, how on earth can replacing that cost 20 grand? The financial stakes for homeowners have truly never been higher, and this single piece of paper perfectly captures the intense frustration that is just bubbling up in neighborhoods across the entire country.
I actually just want to pause and leave this enormous figure up for a second. $20,370.40. Look, if you've experienced this sticker shock recently, I really want to validate your frustration right now. You are not crazy. You're not necessarily just being price gouged by some local contractor, and no, this isn't just standard inflation at work. This staggering number actually represents a fundamental, structural change in the whole HVAC market. It seems inexplicably expensive because behind the scenes, the entire rulebook is changed.
Which leads us to our central mystery, right? Why does replacing your AC suddenly cost as much as a brand new car? Or, well, at least a very reliable used one. To figure this out, we have to look past the contractor, past the basic supply chain, and trace this massive consumer pain point all the way back to its, frankly, pretty surprising origin. We're going to see how a piece of federal legislation, driven by geopolitical strategy and, of all things, high school chemistry, ended up directly draining your bank account.
To start solving this puzzle, we have to understand the transition from the old reality to the new one. Historically, fixing your AC was kind of a commodity market. It was a basic plug-and-play mechanical swap. If a unit died, a tech could usually just swap out a part or replace the unit with a bunch of cheaper generic alternatives. But our new reality? It's drastically different. We've moved totally away from simple mechanical fixes and into the world of highly technical, complex, multi-component environmental upgrades. You're no longer just buying a fan and a compressor. You are buying into a highly regulated, technologically advanced ecosystem.
Now, the massive price increase you're feeling isn't actually just about the physical metal box outside your window. It's really about the chemicals flowing inside of it. For decades, the industry just relied on older refrigerants, stuff like R22 and R410A. But because of international environmental agreements, the market is completely shifting to next-generation chemicals, specifically things called R544B and R32. And here is the kicker. These new chemicals aren't generic, not at all. They're proprietary. They are heavily patent protected. So when you buy a new AC today, you are indirectly paying for the billions of dollars in research, development, and patents that American chemical companies spent to invent these mandatory new substances.
And all of this was catalyzed by a single piece of federal legislation, the American Innovation in Manufacturing, or AIM Act. Signed into law in late 2020, the AIM Act is absolutely the crux of this modern refrigerant shift. It legally mandates a structured, nationwide phase-out of those older hydrofluorocarbons, essentially forcing the entire domestic market to transition toward those expensive, next-generation, patent-protected replacements we just talked about. This is the law that really changed the game for the consumer.
Now, what might actually surprise you is the political origin of this environmental phase-out. The AIM Act wasn't purely some standard climate initiative. It was a heavily bipartisan effort championed by Democratic Senator Tom Carper of Delaware and, crucially, Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. Now, it might seem a little unusual on the surface for a conservative senator from the oil and gas-heavy Gulf Coast to be the primary architect of a massive environmental phase-out bill, right? Well, to understand why, we have to look closely at the economic motivations rather than just the environmental ones.
So the crucial point is captured perfectly in Senator Kennedy's own words. When he was introducing the bill to his colleagues, he openly stated that the legislation looked like complicated high school chemistry, but at its core, simply a jobs bill. The main mechanism here was economic protectionism. American chemical companies had already won the technological race to invent these new refrigerants, so Kennedy's stated goal was to ensure they actually reap the financial rewards by securing domestic manufacturing jobs. And you know what? Those domestic manufacturing jobs were heavily concentrated right in Senator Kennedy's backyard.
Louisiana is a massive hub for advanced chemical manufacturing. We're talking about giant facilities like the Honeywell plant in Geismar and the Mexichem Fluor plant in St. Gabriel. These are huge drivers of the local economy. These specific companies had invested billions into developing these next-generation replacements. By pushing the AIM Act, the legislation directly protected these massive production plants, guaranteeing that this whole multi-billion-dollar market shift would clearly favor American manufacturers.
The geopolitical strategy behind the AIM Act was actually very clear. If Congress didn't step in and give the EPA the regulatory authority to mandate this transition, foreign competitors, specifically manufacturing giants like China, could just easily flood the global and U.S. markets with cheaper, older alternatives. So the legislation was essentially designed to build a regulatory wall. It legally prevented those cheaper alternatives from being sold, ensuring that American chemical companies won the global technological race and locked in their domestic market dominance.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because this legislation didn't create an overnight switch. The AIM Act is actually a 15-year structured phase-out. In year 1, back in late 2020, the act was signed. Right now, around year 5, well, this is where the pain is truly hitting the consumer market. We are seeing the rapid, mandatory obsolescence of older units really begin in earnest. And by year 15, in 2035, the legally mandated phase-out of older HFCs will be entirely complete. Now, this timeline is brilliant for guaranteeing long-term domestic chemical production, but as we're about to see, it has some pretty serious implications for your wallet.
Which brings us to our next section, the hidden consumer cost. We're going to look at exactly how protecting American jobs essentially forces everyday homeowners to pay the price.
Because look, while the macroeconomic benefits for U.S. manufacturing might be clear, the sources highlight several, let's call them unintended consequences for the homeowner. First off, this law triggers the rapid, mandatory obsolescence of perfectly functional older equipment. Because those older refrigerants are being phased out, a simple leak in an old system might mean you can't just top it off anymore. You have to buy a whole new system. This leads to forced multi-component upgrades. Furthermore, remember those billions in proprietary chemical research and development costs? Yeah, they don't just disappear. They are passed directly down the supply chain right to you. Finally, by design, the law completely eliminates lower-cost market alternatives. You are literally legally required to buy the expensive stuff.
And this brilliantly illustrates what those consequences look like in the real world. This is another quote from Holt Plumbing and Heating. And notice, this isn't the premium option we looked at earlier. This is literally labeled their most popular option, a standard 2-ton deluxe heat pump system. And the price? $17,485. The lower-cost alternatives are just gone. And this brings our explainer full circle. That sticker shock you feel, it isn't an accident. It is the direct cause and effect result of the AIM Act, the forced transition to patented chemicals, and the total elimination of cheaper, older technology.
So, what does this all mean? We end up here with a fascinating and very real dilemma. Is protecting American chemical manufacturing supremacy actually worth the heavy financial burden now placed on the average homeowner? It's a really strict trade-off, right? Securing domestic jobs versus the intense personal cost of just keeping your home comfortable. There are no easy answers here, but I promise you the next time you or a neighbor gets a $20,000 quote for an AC unit, you'll know exactly the geopolitical strategy, the high school chemistry, and the federal policy that put that number on the page. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.